Captain Sarah Mitchell had always believed that discipline was the foundation of excellence. It was a philosophy she'd lived by since her first day at the Air Force Academy, 24 years ago. Now, at 42, with silver threads beginning to show at her temples and lines of concentration etched around her sharp blue eyes, she embodied that principle in every aspect of her life. She stood at the window of her small office at Joint Base Andrews, a facility that had been her home for the past 6 years, watching the winter sunlight paint the Virginia landscape in shades of gold and gray. The airfield below bustled with activity, planes taxiing, ground crews moving with purpose, the organized chaos of military aviation in full operation. Her office was sparse, almost austere. Unlike many of her contemporaries who decorated their walls with personal photographs and casual memorabilia, Sarah's space reflected her professional identity alone. Framed commendations hung in perfect alignment. A photograph of her receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross, another showing her with her first command, a certificate acknowledging 15 years of flawless service. No pictures of family, no personal touches that might hint at a life outside these military walls. That was intentional. Sarah Mitchell was defined by her career, and she'd made peace with what that meant long ago. Her commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison, had summoned her that morning with news of her new assignment. She could still hear his voice as she reviewed the details on her computer screen. "Mitchell, I've got a transport run for you. Nothing complicated. High-value passengers, classified cargo. By the book. You're the best we have, and I need you on this one." Colonel Harrison had a habit of making routine assignments sound like they carried the weight of national security. In the military, Sarah had learned, that was often because they did. The mission was scheduled for 9:50 a.m., a simple transport flight from Andrews to a secured military facility in Langley, Virginia. The distance was short, barely 90 minutes of flight time under normal conditions. She'd made this run before numerous times without incident. The route was familiar. The aircraft would be a C-130 Hercules, the workhorse of military aviation, a plane she'd logged over 2,000 hours in. Everything about it screamed routine. Yet Sarah's instincts, those instincts honed by years of reading weather patterns, aircraft systems, and human behavior, whispered that something felt different about this assignment. She'd learned never to ignore those whispers. Sarah pulled up the flight manifest on her secure computer terminal, scrolling through the names of her passengers. Most were military personnel she recognized, enlisted officers, a few contractors who regularly traveled on official business. She knew the type: career soldiers, dedicated professionals who understood the importance of protocol and discretion. But one name caught her attention and held it: Deputy Director James Hendricks, Defense Intelligence Agency, the DIA. That was significant. High-level intelligence officials didn't typically fly on routine transport missions. They had private aircraft, protected channels, executive transportation. The fact that Hendricks was on this flight suggested something more substantial was happening than Colonel Harrison's casual briefing had indicated. Sarah made a mental note to investigate further, but first, she had to focus on her immediate responsibilities. She gathered her flight suit from the back of her office door, worn leather with her name stitched above the left breast pocket, insignia marking her rank, and changed quickly. The suit had been broken in over thousands of flight hours, and it moved with her like a second skin. She performed a ritual she'd executed thousands of times, checking her watch, securing her hair in regulation style, ensuring every detail of her appearance met military standards. Perfection in presentation preceded perfection in execution. That was her creed. As she walked through the corridors of the operations building toward the flight line, Sarah thought about what had drawn her to aviation in the first place. Growing up in Colorado, she'd watched her father, a commercial airline pilot, prepare for flights with a solemnity that bordered on religious. He'd explained to her once that when you took responsibility for dozens of lives, when you lifted a machine weighing thousands of pounds off the ground and trusted it to carry you through the sky, You weren't just performing a job. You were accepting a covenant with every person aboard that aircraft. You were promising them that your skill, your judgment, and your integrity would be sufficient to bring them safely back to Earth. That promise had driven everything Sarah did. She'd entered the Air Force Academy to escape the limitations of her small hometown, but she'd stayed because of purpose. Flying wasn't just what she did, it was who she was. Her career had been marked by consistent excellence. She'd never had an accident, never had a serious incident, never had her judgment questioned. When her crew looked at her, they saw someone they could trust absolutely. When her commanding officers made difficult decisions about critical missions, they thought of Sarah Mitchell. That reputation wasn't something she took lightly. It was something she'd earned through thousands of small decisions to do things correctly, completely, without compromise. The flight line of Joint Base Andrews was a landscape of military precision. Aircraft were arranged in perfect rows, their fuselages gleaming in the pale winter light. Ground crews moved between them with practiced efficiency, performing pre-flight checks with the kind of attention to detail that prevented disasters. Sarah made her way toward her assigned aircraft, the C-130 designated for today's mission, running through her mental checklist of everything she needed to verify before takeoff. Her crew was already assembling. Major David Chen, her co-pilot, was one of the finest pilots Sarah had worked with. He had the kind of calm demeanor that inspired confidence, the kind of technical skill that made flying with him a pleasure rather than a chore. Sergeant Marcus Webb, her flight engineer, had been with Sarah for 4 years. He could troubleshoot aircraft systems with an intuition that bordered on supernatural. Technical Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, her loadmaster, was meticulous about cargo security and passenger safety. Together, they formed a unit of rare quality, a team that had flown together so many times that communication often happened in glances and half-sentences. "Morning, Captain," Chen said as Sarah approached, his greeting casual but his posture respectful. "Weather's clear all the way to Langley. Should be a smooth run." "Let's not assume anything," Sarah replied, her tone professional but not cold. "Start your walk around. I want everything triple-checked before we board passengers. Something feels different about this flight." Chen's expression shifted, reflecting the seriousness in her voice. He nodded once and moved toward the aircraft without further comment. Sarah began her own comprehensive inspection of the C-130, running her hands along the fuselage, checking every detail that she'd verified hundreds of times before. The ritual was familiar, but her focus was intense. As she worked, her mind kept returning to the name on the manifest, Deputy Director Hendricks. There was something about that detail that wouldn't quite release her. She couldn't have known, as she performed her pre-flight inspection that ordinary Tuesday morning, that by the end of the day, her life would be fundamentally and irrevocably changed. The encrypted message arrived at 6:47 a.m., exactly 3 hours and 3 minutes before scheduled takeoff. Sarah was in the operations briefing room, reviewing weather patterns and flight data with her crew, when her secure military phone vibrated silently against her hip. She excused herself and stepped into an adjacent corridor, checking the device with the practiced caution of someone who understood that encrypted communications meant classified information. The message header showed no sender name, only a string of alphanumeric characters that indicated military-grade encryption, the kind of security protocol that required authorization from the highest levels of the Department of Defense. Her fingers hesitated over the screen before she opened it. In her 15 years of service, Sarah had received dozens of encrypted communications, routine reports, classified briefings, operational orders, but something about the timestamp and the unmarked sender triggered a warning in her mind. She opened the message and began reading. "Captain Mitchell, you do not know who this is, and you must not attempt to identify the sender. What follows is classified information that has been discovered through legitimate intelligence channels. Deputy Director James Hendricks is scheduled to board your aircraft this morning as part of the official manifest. What the manifest does not show is that Hendricks has been identified as a person of interest in an active counterintelligence investigation. Evidence suggests he is planning to exfiltrate from the United States with classified materials of the highest order. The intelligence he possesses concerns operational details of 7 active intelligence operations worldwide. The lives of 17 embedded assets depend on this material remaining secure. Hendricks is expected to rendezvous with foreign intelligence operatives upon reaching his destination. He will not reach his destination. You must not allow this flight to proceed as planned. Trust no one but yourself. Delete this message immediately upon reading. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the words a second time, then a third. Her throat felt tight. The message was detailed, specific, alarming, but it was also entirely unverified. The sender identified themselves only as Sentinel, a code name that meant nothing to her. The credentials embedded in the encryption suggested someone with legitimate access to classified networks, but that meant very little. Encryption could be spoofed by someone with sufficient technical skill. The information could be disinformation. It could be a test of her judgment. It could be an elaborate hoax designed to compromise her security clearance or test her loyalty. Sarah moved to a secure terminal in the briefing room and began the delicate process of analyzing the message without leaving obvious digital traces. She pulled up recent news reports, searching for any indication that high-ranking intelligence officials had been arrested or were under investigation. Nothing. She checked the classified intelligence network she had access to as a senior military pilot. No alerts regarding Hendricks. No counterintelligence warnings. The official channels revealed nothing unusual, which meant either the investigation was so sensitive that it existed below even her security clearance level, or the message was completely false. She paced the empty corridor, her mind working through scenarios with military precision. If the message was legitimate, then she possessed information about a catastrophic intelligence breach. 17 embedded assets potentially compromised. Active intelligence operations possibly exposed. That was the kind of information that could change geopolitical dynamics, that could result in deaths, that could compromise national security in ways that would reverberate for years. The weight of that possibility pressed down on her like a physical force. But if the message was false, if she acted on unverified intelligence, she would be violating direct orders, committing an act of insubordination so severe that it would end her career. Court-martial was not a theoretical possibility, it was a probable outcome. At best, she would be dishonorably discharged. At worst, she would face years in a military prison, her reputation destroyed, her life fundamentally altered. Everything she'd built over 2 decades of service would crumble. Sarah returned to her secure phone and studied the message again, looking for any detail that might help her verify its authenticity. The code name Sentinel, the specific number of embedded assets, the reference to 7 active intelligence operations worldwide. These were the kinds of details that someone inside the intelligence community would know. But they were also the kinds of details that could be deduced or guessed by someone with general knowledge of DIA operations. She made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. She would attempt to trace the message's origin without alerting anyone to its receipt. Using a secure protocol, she sent a coded query through a classified network, attempting to identify any recent counterintelligence activity involving high-level DIA personnel. The response came back marked no relevant results. She tried again with different search parameters. Nothing. The clock was ticking. Passengers would begin boarding in less than 3 hours. Sarah found herself standing at the window of the operations building, looking out at the airfield. Her aircraft sat waiting, the ground crew continuing their preparations. Her team was ready. Everything was in position for a routine flight. All she had to do was get aboard, execute the flight plan, and this morning would unfold exactly as scheduled. But the message burned in her mind like a coal. 17 embedded assets, classified intelligence, Deputy Director Hendricks with his expensive suit and his briefcase. She thought about her father, about that covenant she'd made, the promise that her judgment would be sufficient. What did judgment mean in a situation like this? Did it mean following protocol, trusting the system, assuming that official channels would catch anything dangerous? Or did it mean trusting her instincts, accepting information from an unknown source, and taking action that could destroy her? Sarah had always chosen the safe path. She'd always followed regulations, respected the chain of command, trusted the system. And that approach had served her well. She had a pristine record. She had respect. She had security. But sitting in the back of her mind was a different kind of voice, the voice that asked what kind of security mattered if it meant allowing a catastrophic breach of national security. She returned to her secure phone and read the final instruction. Delete this message immediately upon reading. Instead, she saved it. She took a photograph of the screen with a backup device, then deleted the original as instructed. The backup wouldn't leave an obvious digital trail, but it would exist. Evidence. Proof that if she was wrong, she'd had legitimate reason to be wrong. Then Sarah Mitchell made a decision that would alter the course of her life. She would board that aircraft. She would fly that route. But she would be watching Deputy Director James Hendricks with the intensity of a hawk observing prey. She would be ready for whatever happened next. She deleted the message and returned her phone to her hip. The morning suddenly felt very long. James Hendricks arrived at the airfield at 9:15 a.m., exactly 35 minutes before scheduled departure. Sarah watched from the flight deck as the black sedan pulled up to the secured entrance, military police waving it through without the standard thorough inspection that civilian contractors received. Hendricks emerged from the vehicle with practiced efficiency, moving like someone accustomed to power, someone whose presence commanded deference without requiring explicit assertion of authority. He was an unremarkable man in appearance, medium height, slightly overweight in the way that suggested desk work rather than physical activity, hair the color of weathered steel. His suit was expensive, tailored perfectly to his frame, the kind of clothing that cost more than most enlisted officers made in a month. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine. Everything about his external presentation screamed authority and sophistication. But it was the details that caught Sarah's attention. Details that most people wouldn't notice, that she'd trained herself to observe through years of reading subtle human behavior. The briefcase chain to his wrist was the first thing that registered as unusual. It was a custom-made aluminum case, approximately 18 inches long and 12 inches wide, with a heavy security chain running from the handle to what appeared to be a reinforced wrist bracelet. Sarah had never seen a federal official transport documents that way on a routine military flight. Classified information was typically transported in secure courier cases handled by dedicated personnel, not physically chained to an individual's body. The fact that Hendricks was carrying this briefcase personally suggested either extreme paranoia or something genuinely worth protecting. As Hendricks moved through the terminal building toward the secured boarding area, Sarah made a subtle adjustment to her position, ensuring she had a clear line of sight to him. Major Chen noticed her attention and raised an eyebrow in question, but Sarah simply gestured for him to complete the pre-boarding checklist. There was nothing yet concrete enough to voice aloud, nothing that wouldn't sound like paranoia or unfounded suspicion. But every instinct she possessed was beginning to align into a coherent warning. Hendricks' forehead glistened with perspiration despite the cool morning air. The temperature in the operations building was a constant 68 degrees Fahrenheit, maintained by precise climate control systems. There was no logical reason for him to be sweating, yet beads of moisture were visible above his left eyebrow and along his upper lip. His breathing appeared shallow and rapid, not the calm, controlled breathing of someone embarking on routine travel, but the accelerated respiration of someone experiencing elevated stress or anxiety. Sarah studied his eyes as he checked in with the security officer at the boarding gate. His gaze moved constantly, never settling on any single object or person for more than a second or two. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at the security camera mounted in the corner. He looked at the window that opened onto the tarmac where her aircraft waited. His eyes never looked relaxed. They never looked at peace. They looked hunted. He checked his watch. The first time Sarah noted the time, 9:18 a.m. 42 minutes until departure. Hendricks pulled his wrist up to eye level and stared at the watch face for a full 10 seconds before lowering it. His jaw tightened visibly. 30 seconds later, he checked the watch again. And again, 30 seconds after that. He checked his watch 4 times in the span of 90 seconds, each time his expression becoming more tense, more driven by urgency that Sarah couldn't quite name. A military doctor, Major William Richardson, approached Hendricks in the boarding area, greeting him with the friendly familiarity of colleagues who'd encountered each other at government functions and classified briefings. Hendricks responded with perfunctory courtesy, but his attention remained elsewhere. Even while conversing with Richardson, his eyes continued their restless scanning of the environment. His free hand, the one not attached to the briefcase, opened and closed repeatedly at his side, a physical manifestation of tension that suggested he was fighting the impulse to flee. Sarah had studied human psychology as part of her military training. She understood the physiological markers of deception and stress. She could recognize the tells that separated genuine interaction from performative conversation. And every single indicator she was observing suggested that James Hendricks was a man under extraordinary psychological pressure, a man running from something or towards something with desperate urgency. When the final boarding announcement was made, Hendricks stood immediately, gathering a small carry-on bag from the floor beside him. As he rose, Sarah noticed something else. His hands were shaking. Not dramatically, not with the tremor of a neurological condition, but with the subtle vibration of someone whose nervous system was flooded with adrenaline and cortisol, stress hormones, the body's response to perceived danger or threat. He walked toward the boarding ramp that led directly to Sarah's aircraft. This was the moment she'd been preparing for since receiving the encrypted message. This was when she would make direct eye contact, when she would observe his response to her presence, when she would attempt to read something authentic in his demeanor beneath the layers of professional presentation. Sarah positioned herself at the aircraft door, her uniform immaculate, her bearing military perfect. She changed into her formal flight suit, the one with her name and rank clearly visible, the one that communicated authority and professionalism. Major Chen stood beside her, offering the standard greeting to boarding passengers. Hendricks approached and Sarah extended her hand in welcome. "Deputy Director Hendricks, I'm Captain Sarah Mitchell. Welcome aboard. We're pleased to have you with us today." For a split second, his expression flickered. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but Sarah caught it clearly. It was the expression of a man encountering an unexpected element in a carefully planned scenario. His handshake was brief and perfunctory, and his palm was damp with nervous perspiration. When he met her eyes, Sarah saw something that confirmed every suspicion the encrypted message had planted. She saw guilt. Not simple guilt, not the minor discomfort of a man whose secrets were slightly questionable. She saw the profound, existential guilt of someone who had crossed a moral line that couldn't be uncrossed, someone who was living with consequences that weighed heavily on their conscience. "A smooth flight, I hope, Captain," Hendricks said, his voice steady despite the physical manifestations of his anxiety. It was the statement of someone experienced at hiding truth beneath professional veneer. But his eyes betrayed him. They moved away from hers too quickly, breaking contact before he'd finished speaking. "We'll do everything in our power to ensure passenger comfort, sir," Sarah replied, maintaining her professional demeanor while cataloging every observation into her memory. "Please take your seat, and we'll be departing momentarily." As Hendricks moved past her into the cabin, Sarah caught the scent of expensive cologne mixed with something else, the sharp, acidic smell of nervous sweat. She watched him settle into his seat, the briefcase still chained to his wrist, his jaw tight, his shoulders tense. Sarah exchanged a brief glance with Major Chen, then returned to the flight deck. She didn't need verification from external sources anymore. The encrypted message had contained truth. She could feel it with absolute certainty. Something terrible was about to unfold, and she was the only person who could stop it. The C-130 Hercules rumbled with the distinctive sound of its 4 turboprop engines as Sarah initiated the starting sequence. It was a sound she'd heard thousands of times, a sound that had become almost meditative in its familiarity, the rhythmic percussion of military aviation in motion. She sat in the left seat of the flight deck, her hands moving across the controls with practiced precision. Major Chen occupied the right seat, his attention focused on the auxiliary systems and navigation parameters. Behind them, Sergeant Webb monitored the engineering systems, while Technical Sergeant Rodriguez coordinated the final passenger loading from her position at the cargo ramp. The time was 9:47, 3 minutes until scheduled departure. Everything was proceeding according to protocol. The weather was clear. All systems were nominal. The flight plan had been filed with air traffic control. The passenger manifest was complete. To any external observer, this was a routine military transport flight, one of dozens that departed Joint Base Andrews every single day. But Sarah's hands had begun to shake slightly, and she forced herself to breathe deeply, controlling her heart rate through the methodical breathing techniques she'd learned as a young pilot. She was running on instinct and suspicion, nothing more. The encrypted message could still be false. The behavioral indicators she'd observed in Hendricks could have innocent explanations. She was operating in a state of heightened awareness based on unverified intelligence from an anonymous source. Yet she couldn't shake the certainty that something catastrophic was about to occur if she didn't act. "Flight plan filed and confirmed," Chen reported, his voice steady and professional. "We're cleared for immediate pushback. Tower is ready for our departure sequence." Sarah keyed the radio transmitter, speaking in the clipped, professional cadence that characterized military aviation communication. "Andrews ground. This is Hercules 742, requesting pushback authorization from the gate." The response came back immediately, crisp and routine. "Hercules 742, Andrews ground, you are cleared for pushback. Runway 27 is in use. Expect to hold at the run-up pad for final clearance." "Roger that, Andrews ground. Hercules 742, pushback in progress." Sarah nodded to Webb, who supervised the ground crew disconnecting the tug that had been holding the aircraft in position at the gate. The massive plane began to move backward, guided by the tow vehicle. Sarah monitored the movement carefully, watching the wing clearance on her external camera feeds. The pushback was smooth and controlled, exactly as it should be. But as they cleared the gate and began the movement toward the active runway, something changed. The radio, which had been displaying routine air traffic chatter, various aircraft reporting their positions, ground crews coordinating movements, suddenly erupted with an urgent override signal. The transmission cut through all other communications with the unmistakable sound of emergency priority. "All aircraft stand down immediately. All aircraft stand down. No-fly zone declared effective immediately for departure corridor 3. Repeat, all aircraft stand down. No-fly zone has been declared." Sarah's stomach clenched. The voice belonged to someone with authority, someone operating from the air traffic control tower with the power to shut down all flight operations in a specific corridor. She glanced at Chen, whose expression had shifted from routine professionalism to concentrated alertness. He was already pulling up the no-fly zone information on the navigation display. "Hercules 742, the tower called again, this time specifically targeting her aircraft. Stand by. You are to remain at your current position. Acknowledge." Sarah's hands felt cold as she keyed the radio. "Andrews ground, Hercules 742 acknowledging, standing by at current position. Request information regarding no-fly zone. There was a pause, not long, perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. During those 3 seconds, Sarah's mind was processing what this meant. A no-fly zone wasn't declared casually. It wasn't an administrative procedure or a routine safety measure. A no-fly zone was issued in response to catastrophic situations, whether emergencies, airspace conflicts, security threats of the highest magnitude. A no-fly zone was issued when authorities needed to control who was in the sky and why. Hercules 742, the tower responded, but the voice was different now. It carried an undertone of urgency that hadn't been present in earlier communications. We are coordinating with command authority. No information regarding the no-fly zone can be released at this time. You are to maintain your current position and await further instructions. Roger that, Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. Standing by. She brought the tow vehicle to a halt, their aircraft now positioned on a taxiway between the main gate and the run-up pad. Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see movement on the ground, more movement than normal flight operations would generate. A security vehicle had appeared on the tarmac, moving with obvious purpose. Another followed, then a third. She counted at least 5 security vehicles now positioned around the airfield, and more were appearing every second. Captain, Chen said quietly, his professional demeanor intact but his voice tense. What's happening? Sarah didn't answer immediately. She was watching the ground, observing the tactical positioning of the security vehicles. They were deploying in a way that suggested they were preparing to intercept something, to prevent something from happening. The pattern of their movements was not random. It was coordinated. It was prepared. She thought of the encrypted message. Hendricks is expected to rendezvous with foreign intelligence operatives upon reaching his destination. He will not reach his destination. I'm not certain, Sarah said finally, keeping her voice level, but I suspect we're about to find out. In the cabin behind her, James Hendricks was surely beginning to realize that something was wrong. The aircraft had come to an unexpected stop. No explanation had been provided. The flight that should have departed 3 minutes ago was now grounded, surrounded by security personnel. Sarah's mind raced through her options. She could comply with the tower's order and wait for official guidance. That was the correct procedure, the protocol that every military officer was trained to follow. Wait for clarification. Respect the chain of command. Trust that the system would handle the situation appropriately. But the encrypted message burned in her memory. The lives of 17 embedded assets depend on this material remaining secure. What if the no-fly zone order was designed to allow Hendricks to be intercepted at the gate? What if federal authorities were moving to arrest him, but he managed to escape the aircraft and destroy the evidence? What if the system, in its deliberate and sometimes bureaucratic pace, wasn't fast enough to prevent a catastrophic breach of national security? Sarah looked out at the tarmac, at the security vehicles beginning to approach her aircraft. She looked at her instruments, at the navigation display showing her position. She looked at the runway that stretched ahead, clear and available, only 100 meters away. And she made a decision that would change everything. Chen, she said quietly, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Chen looked at her, confusion and concern evident in his expression. Captain. Can you trust me? Sarah repeated, her voice iron. Yes, ma'am, Chen said without hesitation. In that moment, Sarah realized that was the true measure of leadership, not respect or authority, but the willingness of your crew to follow you into uncertainty based on nothing but faith in your judgment. Sarah reached for the radio transmitter, but she didn't call the tower. Instead, she called the ground crew. Ground crew, this is Captain Mitchell. Resume pushback. We have a situation that requires immediate action. Captain Chen said, What are you doing? My job, Sarah replied. and she began moving toward the runway. The moment Sarah gave the order to resume pushback, she felt something shift inside her, a fundamental crossing of a threshold from which there would be no retreat. The tow vehicle resumed its backward motion, pulling the massive C-130 away from the gate and toward the active taxiway. On the ground below, Sarah could see security personnel beginning to move with more urgency, radios crackling with communications she couldn't hear but could easily interpret. They were responding to her unexpected movement. They were attempting to understand what was happening. The radio erupted. "Hercules 742, this is Andrew's ground. I say again, you are ordered to maintain your current position. Do not proceed toward the runway. Acknowledge this order immediately." Sarah's hands remained steady on the controls despite the thundering of her heart. She didn't respond to the tower. Instead, she reached over and adjusted the radio frequency, switching to the internal crew communications channel. "All crew, this is the captain," she said, her voice calm and measured, though every nerve in her body was screaming. "I am declaring a priority security situation. We are proceeding to the runway for immediate departure. This is not a routine flight. I need absolute focus and absolute compliance with my orders. Is that understood?" There was a moment of silence. Sarah realized that she'd just given orders that violated direct instructions from air traffic control. She just initiated an act of insubordination so severe that it would result in court-martial proceedings if she was wrong. If she was wrong, her career was over. If she was wrong, she would spend years in military prison. If she was wrong, she would be remembered as the officer who created chaos and endangered lives based on paranoid suspicion. "Understood, Captain," Major Chen said quietly. There was no hesitation in his voice, no questioning. He trusted her. That trust was the most terrifying thing Sarah had ever experienced. "Ready, Captain," Sergeant Webb confirmed from the engineering station. "Standing by," Technical Sergeant Rodriguez reported from her position. Sarah advanced the throttles, and the 4 turboprop engines responded with increased power. The aircraft continued its movement toward the active runway, picking up speed. The tow vehicle disconnected from the nose gear, and the C-130 became fully independent, reliant now only on Sarah's skill and judgment. "Hercules 742, this is Andrew's ground. I am ordering you to stop your forward progress immediately. You are in direct violation of the no-fly zone order. Stop immediately, or we will be forced to take emergency measures." Sarah keyed the radio one final time. Her voice when she spoke was steady and professional, the voice of a military officer accustomed to making life-and-death decisions. "Andrew's ground, this is Hercules 742. We have a security concern with one of our passengers. I am conducting an emergency diversion to secure military facilities. I am aware of the no-fly zone order. I am proceeding anyway. Over." She released the transmit button and didn't wait for a response. She already knew what it would be: more orders to stop, more threats, more demands that she comply with protocol. But protocol in this moment felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. The runway was directly ahead now, stretching out before her like a gray concrete path into whatever consequences awaited. Sarah performed the abbreviated pre-takeoff checklist that she'd memorized years ago. Flight surfaces free and correct, engines in green, fuel pressures nominal, electrical systems confirmed. Everything was ready, everything was in place. From the cabin behind the cockpit, Sarah heard a commotion. A passenger had realized that something was wrong, a door slamming, a voice raised in protest or confusion, but she couldn't afford to focus on that now. Later, there would be time for explanations. Now there was only the moment, only the decision, only the action. "Hercules 742 is cleared for immediate takeoff," Sarah announced, more to herself than to anyone else. The tower hadn't given clearance, but clearance was no longer a consideration. She was past the point of seeking permission. She advanced the throttles to full power. The engines shrieked in response, their turboprops biting into the air with tremendous force. The aircraft lurched forward, its massive frame accelerating down the runway with surprising speed. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of building momentum, the gravity pressing her into her seat, the controls responding to her inputs with immediate and decisive obedience. Through the cockpit windows, she could see ground vehicles moving rapidly across the airfield, attempting to position themselves in front of her aircraft. But they were too slow. The C-130, despite its enormous size and weight, was moving faster now, eating up the concrete runway with every passing second. 30 knots, 40 knots, 50 knots. The aircraft's massive frame vibrated with the intensity of full throttle. "Speed is good," Chen reported, his voice professional despite the extraordinary circumstances. He was reading the instruments, providing her with data, assisting her in executing a takeoff that violated every direct order from their command authority. 60 knots, 70, rotation speed approaching. Sarah could feel the moment when the aircraft wanted to fly, when the aerodynamic forces exceeded the aircraft's weight. It was a sensation she'd felt thousands of times, but never in circumstances like these. Never while defying direct orders. Never while committing an act that would be interpreted as mutiny by some, as heroism by others, as insanity by still others. 85 knots. The nose landing gear felt light. "Rotation," Chen called. Sarah pulled back gently on the control yoke. The nose of the aircraft pitched upward. The runway fell away beneath her. The wheels left the tarmac, and the C-130 climbed into the sky with the inevitability of a stone thrown upward, defying gravity for one critical moment before being pulled back down by the weight of consequences. But as the landing gear began to retract into the aircraft's fuselage, as the terrain began to shrink below her, Sarah realized that she had crossed a point of absolute no return. She was airborne. She was in violation of direct orders. She was committing an act of insubordination that would result in a military investigation, that would probably result in criminal charges, that would certainly result in the end of her military career. 200 feet above the ground, the radio crackled with frantic communication from the tower. "Hercules 742, you are in direct violation of standing orders. Land immediately. I repeat, land immediately or we will scramble interceptor aircraft." Sarah's hands tightened on the controls. Interceptor aircraft. Fighter jets. They would be vectored toward her position within minutes. They would approach her from behind or from the sides, and they would attempt to force her to divert or land at a designated airfield. She had minutes, perhaps less, before this situation escalated into a direct confrontation with military assets under orders to stop her. She leveled out at 500 feet and adjusted her heading toward Langley, 89 miles away. 90 minutes of flight time under normal conditions. But these weren't normal conditions. Sarah pushed the throttles forward, eking out every additional knot of airspeed the aircraft could produce. The needle climbed toward 250 knots, pushing the C-130 toward the upper limit of its design specifications. "Captain," Chen said, his voice tense but controlled, "we have fighter contacts appearing on radar. 2 aircraft vectoring toward our position from the north." Sarah nodded, her attention fixed on the horizon, on the instruments, on the impossible situation she'd created through a single decision made in a moment of conviction. In the cabin behind her, James Hendricks was surely beginning to understand that something catastrophic had occurred, that his carefully planned escape had encountered an unexpected variable, that his future, whatever he'd imagined it to be, had just transformed into something entirely different. Sarah Mitchell had just made a choice that would define the rest of her life. Whether that choice would ultimately be vindicated or condemned was now entirely beyond her control. She was committed, the point of return had passed. And all that remained was to see what happened next. The moment the aircraft's wheels left the ground, James Hendricks realized with absolute certainty that something had gone catastrophically wrong. He'd been seated in the first row of passenger seating, just behind the cockpit bulkhead, and he'd felt the sudden acceleration down the runway with confusion and growing alarm. Commercial flights didn't accelerate that rapidly. Military transport flights certainly didn't execute takeoffs without proper clearance and coordination with air traffic control. Something was wrong. Terribly, fundamentally wrong. When the nose of the aircraft pitched upward and the ground fell away beneath them, Hendricks unbuckled his seatbelt with shaking hands. Other passengers looked at him with confusion and mild concern, but none of them understood what he understood, that his carefully orchestrated escape was unraveling in real time. The plan had been meticulous. Fly to Langley, deplaned with priority clearance, transfer to a private aircraft waiting at a secured hangar, be in international airspace within 2 hours. Be in a country without extradition treaties within 4 hours. But now the aircraft was climbing steeply, heading in a direction that didn't match the flight plan he'd reviewed. The angle of ascent, the banking maneuvers, everything suggested they weren't heading toward Langley. Everything suggested they were heading somewhere else entirely. Hendricks moved toward the cockpit door with desperate urgency, his briefcase still chained to his wrist. He began pounding on the reinforced steel door with his free hand, the sound hollow and ineffectual against the noise of the aircraft's engines. "Open this door," he shouted. "Captain Mitchell, open this door immediately." In the cockpit, Sarah heard the pounding clearly. She glanced at Chen, whose expression remained focused and professional despite the extraordinary circumstances. She keyed the internal communications channel. "This is the captain. All passengers will remain in their seats. We are experiencing a security situation. Any attempt to enter the cockpit will be met with force. Remain seated and await instructions." The pounding continued for another 30 seconds before stopping abruptly. Hendricks had realized that physical force wasn't going to open a cockpit door designed specifically to prevent unauthorized access. "Hercules 742, this is scrambled fighter flight. Call sign Viper 1 and Viper 2. A new voice crackled through the radio. The speaker was a fighter pilot, someone trained to pursue and intercept aircraft. "You are ordered to level off and establish a southern heading toward Joint Base Quantico. Do you copy?" Sarah maintained her westward heading toward Langley. "Viper 1, this is Hercules 742. I copy your transmission. I am unable to comply. I have a security situation aboard my aircraft that requires diversion to a secure military facility. Stand by for additional information." "Hercules 742, Viper 1 responded, his tone hardening. "You are in direct violation of multiple standing orders. You are to establish the heading I provided immediately, or we will be forced to implement intercept protocols." Sarah could see the fighter jets now on her radar display, 2 blips converging on her position from the north, their airspeed considerably greater than her own. They would be visible out the cockpit windows within seconds. She had perhaps 4 minutes before they were in position to force her compliance through superior maneuverability and firepower. "Viper 1, Hercules 742, Sarah transmitted, her voice steady and professional. "I am aware of your tactical advantage. I am requesting that you relay the following to command authority. I am diverting to Langley Air Force Base with a critical security detainee aboard this aircraft. The detainee is a federal employee under investigation for espionage. I am conducting this diversion to prevent the destruction of classified materials and the escape of a suspected foreign intelligence asset. Request permission to proceed directly to secure holding facilities at Langley." There was a pause, longer than the previous pauses, which suggested that the fighter pilots were communicating with their command authority, that her message was being relayed up the chain of command, that someone was beginning to understand that this wasn't simple insubordination or a mental health crisis. This was something more substantive. In the cabin, the situation was deteriorating. A major, Sarah later learned his name was Major William Richardson, the medical officer, had moved toward Hendricks, attempting to subdue him or at least prevent him from causing further disturbance. But Hendricks was fighting with the desperation of a man facing decades in federal prison. He'd kicked Richardson in the leg and had moved toward the emergency exit, as if somehow opening a door at 20,000 feet might constitute an escape route. Technical Sergeant Rodriguez, positioned at the interior cabin entrance, keyed her radio. "Captain, we have a passenger attempting to access the emergency exit. Medical officer is attempting to restrain. Situation is escalating." Sarah's jaw tightened. An emergency exit opened at altitude would cause explosive decompression, would kill everyone aboard the aircraft, would accomplish nothing except mutual destruction. She needed to end this situation, needed to ground the aircraft, needed to establish control before panic spread through the cabin and created secondary emergencies. "Rodriguez, use whatever force is necessary to prevent that exit from being opened," Sarah ordered. "Restrain that passenger by any means available." In the cabin, Rodriguez, a woman of substantial physical presence and military training, moved rapidly toward Hendricks. He saw her approaching and attempted to change direction, but the briefcase chain to his wrist limited his mobility. He was trapped by his own precautions, constrained by the security measures he'd implemented to protect his stolen materials. Rodriguez tackled him with professional efficiency, driving him away from the emergency exit and toward the floor. Other military personnel aboard, officers and enlisted staff who'd been on routine travel, moved to assist, forming a human barrier between Hendricks and any other potential escape route. Within seconds, Hendricks was subdued, his arms pinned, his movements constrained. "Passenger is secured," Rodriguez reported. "No injuries sustained." "Roger that," Sarah acknowledged. "Maintain restraint and monitor for signs of medical distress." Outside the aircraft, the two F-16 fighters had established position on either side of her wings. Through the cockpit windows, Sarah could see them clearly now, sleek, deadly aircraft carrying weapons systems that could disable or destroy her massive transport plane without significant effort. The lead pilot transmitted again. "Hercules 742, this is Viper 1. Command authority is processing your situation. You are cleared to proceed to Langley, but understand that we will be escorting you. Any deviation from direct course will result in immediate action. Is that understood?" Sarah exhaled slowly, feeling tension release from shoulders she hadn't realized were completely rigid. "Viper 1, understood. Establishing direct course to Langley. ETA approximately 42 minutes. "Roger that, Hercules 742. Maintain current altitude and airspeed. We will maintain escort position." Sarah adjusted her heading slightly, now pointing the massive aircraft directly toward Langley Air Force Base. Behind her in the cabin, James Hendricks lay on the floor, physically and psychologically broken, his escape plan destroyed, his future reduced to legal proceedings and imprisonment. In the cockpit, Major Chen maintained the navigation systems while Sergeant Webb monitored the engines and engineering systems that propelled them through the sky. And Sarah Mitchell, the pilot with 15 years of flawless service and a reputation for judgment, had just committed an act of insubordination so severe that it would require a detailed investigation, a full military review, and the determination of whether she'd acted heroically or catastrophically. The flight continued toward Langley, 40 minutes of uncertainty and tension stretching ahead, with fighter jets maintaining escort position and the future remaining completely unknown. The military investigation began before Sarah's aircraft had even come to a complete stop at Langley Air Force Base. Federal agents swarmed the tarmac with the coordinated precision of a tactical operation. Military police established a perimeter around the C-130. James Hendricks was extracted from the aircraft in restraints, his face a mask of shock and resignation, the briefcase still chained to his wrist. Sarah and her crew were separated immediately, each taken to individual interrogation rooms where the real reckoning would begin. For 72 hours, Sarah sat in a secure facility while military investigators questioned her repeatedly, methodically, with the kind of intensity reserved for officers suspected of serious crimes. The questions were relentless. Why had she disobeyed direct orders? What was the source of her intelligence about Hendricks? How had she known about the no-fly zone before it was announced? Did she have unauthorized contact with intelligence agencies? Was she acting on her own initiative, or as part of a larger conspiracy? Sarah answered every question with careful precision, describing the encrypted message in detail, explaining her decision-making process, acknowledging that she had violated multiple direct orders. She understood that her military career was likely finished. Court-martial proceedings seemed inevitable. The possibility of prison time was real. She'd made peace with those consequences before takeoff, but sitting in the interrogation room, facing the weight of institutional military authority, the reality of potential imprisonment felt considerably heavier than abstract acceptance. But then on the third day, everything changed. The briefcase that had been chained to James Hendricks' wrist was opened, and its contents were analyzed by the Defense Intelligence Agency's forensic specialists. What they found confirmed the encrypted message in every detail. The briefcase contained 17 separate intelligence files, each documenting active operations in foreign countries. The files included names of embedded intelligence assets, operational procedures, communication protocols, and geolocation data for covert stations. The value of this material, if it had reached a foreign intelligence service, would have been incalculable. 17 lives would almost certainly have been lost. The investigation into Hendricks' background revealed a man living a double life. His position as deputy director of the DIA had given him access to classified information, which he'd been systematically copying and preparing to sell to Russian intelligence operatives. The price he'd negotiated was $30 million. The rendezvous point was supposed to be at Langley, where he would have transferred to a private aircraft owned by a front company. Sarah's diversion had prevented him from reaching that aircraft. But the encrypted message that had started everything, the message from someone calling themselves Sentinel, still needed explanation. The investigation traced the origin of that message to an intelligence analyst named Dr. Richard Kovac, a 30-year veteran of the DIA who had discovered Hendricks' espionage activities through routine security audits. Kovac, recognizing that official channels might be compromised or too slow to act, had made the extraordinary decision to contact Sarah directly, using encryption protocols and anonymous routing to mask his identity. When confronted by investigators, Kovac explained his reasoning with the kind of moral clarity that transcended military regulations. He'd known about Hendricks' plans for 3 days before Sarah's flight was scheduled. He'd reported his findings to his direct supervisor, but bureaucratic procedures meant that an investigation would take weeks. Action would take even longer. Kovac had calculated that by the time official procedures were completed, Hendricks would be in international territory with stolen intelligence. So he'd made the unilateral decision to contact someone he believed capable of acting decisively, a pilot with an impeccable record, and the authority to control who boarded her aircraft. The investigation gradually shifted from interrogating Sarah about her insubordination to examining her decision-making process. Military psychologists analyzed her response to the threat. Strategic thinkers evaluated the operational outcome. Senior commanders reviewed her actions against the backdrop of national security consequences. The conclusion was unanimous. Sarah Mitchell had made the correct decision, implemented it with exceptional judgment, and prevented a catastrophic breach of national security. 4 weeks after landing at Langley, Sarah was formally cleared of all charges. Not only was she exonerated, but she was commended for exceptional judgment under extraordinary circumstances and awarded the Defense Meritorious Service Medal, one of the highest honors for non-combat actions. Her commanding officer, Colonel James Harrison, presented the medal personally, his expression one of profound respect. "Captain Mitchell," he said formally, though his voice carried genuine emotion, "your actions on that morning demonstrated the kind of leadership and integrity that defines the highest standards of military service. You were faced with an impossible choice, and you chose correctly. We're proud to have you in our command." James Hendrick's trial was brief and conclusive. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The classified documents provided definitive proof of his espionage activities. Intelligence analysts confirmed that he'd been in active negotiations with Russian intelligence operatives. Text messages on his personal devices showed the explicit nature of the transaction. He was convicted of espionage, sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, and confined to a maximum security facility in Colorado where he would spend the remainder of his life. Sarah continued her military career with renewed purpose. She was promoted to major within 18 months, then to colonel 5 years later. She flew for another 8 years, accumulating additional flight hours and commendations, mentoring younger pilots with the kind of wisdom that comes from having faced extraordinary circumstances and emerged with integrity intact. When she finally retired from active service at age 50, having accumulated 23 years of military experience, Sarah was celebrated not just as an accomplished pilot, but as a symbol of principled leadership. Her story spread through military academies and command schools, studied in classes about decision-making, ethical judgment, and the complex relationship between following orders and serving higher principles of national security. Military instructors used her case study to teach future officers about the rare situations when disobeying direct orders becomes not just permissible but morally necessary. They discussed the burden of recognizing those moments, the courage required to act despite overwhelming institutional pressure to comply with protocol. Sarah wrote a memoir 10 years into her retirement, titled Breaking Protocol: The Day I Defied Orders to Protect the Nation. The book became required reading at several military institutions. In interviews, she was consistently humble about her actions, emphasizing that she'd been fortunate to receive the intelligence from Dr. Kovac, that she'd made her decision based on information she couldn't verify, that she'd been lucky it had worked out. But in her quieter moments, Sarah understood the deeper truth. She'd made the decision not because she had absolute certainty, but because she trusted her instincts about human behavior and threat assessment. She'd read James Hendrick's anxiety and guilt with the precision that comes from decades of observing people under stress. She'd recognized that the encrypted message, though unverified, came from someone with legitimate access to classified information. She'd understood that sometimes the only way to protect the institution was to violate its rules. In her final public address before retirement, speaking to a gathering of military officers and government officials, Sarah reflected on the nature of leadership. "We train our military personnel to follow orders, to respect the chain of command, to trust in institutions and protocols," she said. "Those are essential principles, but we must also create space for individuals with integrity to recognize moments when following orders would betray the very principles we've sworn to defend. That's not anarchy, that's the highest form of patriotism." Sarah Mitchell never commanded a major operation. She never led thousands of soldiers into battle. She never influenced grand strategic policy. But on one ordinary Tuesday morning in 2019, a pilot with 15 years of service made a decision that prevented a catastrophic intelligence breach, protected 17 embedded assets, and preserved the security of her nation. And in doing so, she became a legend, not because she was perfect, but because she was human enough to recognize danger, brave enough to act despite fear, and principled enough to accept the consequences of her choices. That was her legacy. That was how she changed history. Not through grandeur or ceremony, but through quiet, decisive action when it mattered most.